Let's try that again. Looks like StreamYard dropped us. Glenn Naughton, Jet Nation Radio, JetNation.com. Uh, Log into JetNation.com. Become an active member of the most active Jets message board on the web. So we were talking about Zach Wilson before we got dropped here. As I said before, learned about the deal. Literally, when I hopped on live with Biff Sweeney of No Fly Zone Radio, I wanted to talk a little bit more about it now. As a Jets fan, you just hope this team learns, right? Zach Wilson, like him or not, immensely talented kid, incredibly live arm, has the ability to escape pressure, has the accuracy issues he had in the pros were non-existent in college, and I get that it's a different league, but you shouldn't be able to go from hitting guys on a dime 20 yards downfield to all of a sudden not being able to hit a guy 5 feet in front of your face. And that's what we saw with Zach Wilson. And I saw some comments earlier, and I don't think anyone objectively would disagree. ESPN, Dan Orlovsky, he said the Jets failed Zach Wilson, and the Jets acknowledged this. Joe Douglas said last year, look, we played him too early. And the Jets failed Zach in a lot of ways. First off, the Jets didn't fail Zach the same way they failed Sam Darnold. George says he's glad Zach's gone, and a lot of people are. A lot of people didn't like Zach, and that's the nature of being in the NFL. Not everyone's going to like you. In some cases, a lot of people aren't going to like you. But with Zach Wilson, the Jets basically brought in a guy from a small time program. And the one thing, sorry, with the Darnold stuff. The way they failed Darnold, of course, the most important way was not having any talent around him. Robbie Anderson. I thought Robbie was a nice player. I thought he could be 1,000-yard guy. He was his second year in Carolina when he was healthy, and teams actually targeted him. I think with the right team, he could have had a few 1,000-yard seasons. That didn't happen. But when Robbie's your far and away your best weapon, and the offensive line was a shambles. They had guys who lacked talent. They had guys who couldn't stay healthy. They had guys, God bless Brian Winters, playing hurt all the time. But they failed Sam in that way. They failed, Sanchez really was the guy who was most set up for success because he didn't have to do a whole lot. It was like, we're going to build this monster O-line. We're going to get a monster running back. And kid, you're going to hand it off 35 times a game. And every now and then we'll ask you to, throw play action pass. So Sanchez was asked to do, even after several years of having the opportunity to not have to be a 25, 35 time a game drop back passer, Sanchez actually had time to develop. But once he was put in a system where he was asked to be the guy, he was out of the NFL. Geno Smith, and someone, a friend of mine messaged me earlier, said, how funny is it Geno ended up being the best of the bunch? Well, what's different from Geno than the others? Geno, because of his career path, he ended up having literally 5-6 years to sit down and watch Hall of Fame quarterbacks. Again, I get that he's a meme at this point, but Russell Wilson was a guy, you look at his best 6-7 years, he's a Hall of Fame candidate. Eli Manning, he played behind Eli, who, Hall of Fame, debatable. I'm not even going to get into that. But basically, Geno had many, many years to sit down and watch, let's just say, very successful quarterbacks operate on offense, how they prepared, what they did on a weekly basis, pick their brains for tips and, to gain that knowledge. Think back to Darnold, who I mentioned, right? The best he ever looked was when he had Josh McCown on in that QB room with him. A true veteran leader who he could lean on, who could answer his questions, who had played in every system for every coach. Like that's invaluable. And it's frustrating because that might be the one thing the Jets did for Zach Wilson was that gave you some hope is they brought in a guru in Greg Knapp. And of course he suffers the biking accident in which he loses his life. And the Jets do nothing to correct. They don't say, all right, well, we lost Greg Knapp. Now who do we bring in? That didn't happen. They just stuck with what they had, which is always the case with the Jets. They, some guys with no track record of developing anyone. So Zach Wilson, for all the faults, and there are plenty, the Jets, they've done it again. I mean, at what point do you say maybe it's this team's approach? And it's always that there's so many different regimes that have failed this team at quarterback. It's almost a little bit scary, but Woody Johnson is the guy in the building who can turn around and say, "Hey guys, we got to stop doing this. We got to stop drafting guys from either small programs where small programs where they'll be jumping right to the NFL, or gimmick offenses. Geno, West Virginia air raid, drop back and launch it. You're not doing that. You're not dropping back and throwing 50 bombs in the NFL. That's what Geno did at West Virginia. Darnold didn't have a ton of starts. So, and look, you can point to there are quarterbacks who have success in year one, but a lot of that comes down to where guys are coming from. What program did you go to? Did you play at a major program? Did you have a bunch of starts? Did you have NFL level caliber coaching? I mean, I would argue there are college coaching staffs out there that are superior to the Jets coaching staff. That's not even a question. So let's see. KD says, "Can we finally be a QB factory?" Joe, listen. Hopefully, and this is the hope here. You failed again. I have a hard time saying you failed Sanchez because you elevated him. Sanchez got to experience a level of success that he wouldn't have with most other teams. But Geno failed, moved on. And listen, I'm not sitting here saying draft someone this year and develop him for 7 years like Geno did. No. But draft someone this year and let them sit behind a couple of veterans in Rodgers and Taylor and be able to learn from them. When was the last time the Jets took a viable, I don't mean day three. I'm not talking about Taj Boyd. But when was the last time they took a guy and gave them a year or two, God forbid 3? I mean, we all hope, right? Let's hope Aaron Rodgers has 2 or 3 years left in him. And somebody like Jordan Travis or Michael Pratt, or even, we talked about Devin Leary, who's a day 3 guy, but I think there's stuff that you can work with there. Why not take one of those guys? And I think the Jets will. But the question, because let's see. Broncos fan here. The whole league is left. I don't think so. Look, it's a swap of day 3 picks, Jarrell. I'm not laughing at the Broncos. Like you're rolling the dice with a day 3 pick on a guy who just a few years ago was the 2nd overall pick. Teams aside, I love these moves. I love when I see a team that says, here's a guy that we think has been done wrong by his former club. We think we can get him right. Even if you can say, you know what, we can make Zach a quality backup. That's not bad for a 6th, 7th round swap. Do you think Rodgers is injury prone? I think he's got to be treated as if he's injury prone because he is 41 years old now and he's coming off an Achilles. You can't go in and that's kind of, and we'll do an offseason recap because, at least for me, of course, you're following the offseason as it goes. And what I mean is after the draft, myself, Chris Schubert, Dylan Terman will be live tomorrow night, our final show before the draft. But we'll do an offseason wrap up after the draft. There'll be some little moves after that. Because as they're happening, when free agency hits and you're filling needs and you're adding guys, especially as a Jets fan with what we've dealt with the last year, you're just happy. Like, yes, all right, we got Tyrod Taylor, proven veteran. He can carry you through 4, 5, 6 games and get you some wins. Great. And that's how I feel about Tyrod Taylor. But, thinking about it earlier today and thinking about the Aaron Rodgers injury situation, and I know we've talked about how Tyrod Taylor has been not the most durable guy either. That kind of something I got stuck on a little bit today. Like, all right, you're obviously happy. You're very happy that it's Tyrod Taylor, not Tim Boyle. But should you have looked at an option? Should you have looked at a guy who was more durable? And I don't know. I mean, you've got to take a quarterback in this draft, obviously, and I 100% expect them to. But if Rodgers goes down, and let's say he's going to miss 6 games, can Tyrod Taylor last 6 games? Every time I've seen him play the last few years, he gets hurt. And look, I'm not going to sit here and say that I've watched every game Tyrod Taylor's played in the last couple of years. Let's see. KD says, Glenn is someone who watches more college tape than me. What's the ratio of air raid QBs to other QBs? These pass-heavy college offenses don't help these guys in the NFL. It's a great question, KD. I mean, I look at these guys individually, and that's not the type of data that I track. But I know that we have seen guys, again, Geno is a good example. But then you could flip and say, look, Pat Mahomes. A lot of people when he was at Texas Tech thought he wasn't a first round guy. There were a lot of people that described him as sort of the most difficult evaluation you could do because the skill set was there, but what he was asked to do wasn't really what you do in the NFL. So, and listen, and Bernard, Rodgers hasn't been injury prone through his career, but again, once you hit 40, take my word for it. It's easier to get hurt and it takes longer to heal. So anytime a QB, especially a QB, hits 40 years old, you get the injury red flag. And after what happened to Rodgers last year, that flag's a lot higher and a lot brighter. So yeah, that's a concern there. And he was hurt the previous year too. Wasn't major, but he had the thumb injury. So he had the thumb 2 years ago, the Achilles this year, and now here we go, 41 years old. Like, you're not going to get more durable as you get older. So yeah, but as I was saying though, the Pat Mahomes is a guy who had an elite skill set in college, but people weren't sure about what he could do in the NFL. So now the Jets are sitting there with the draft coming, and here's a thought I had the other day, and it's risky because a guy can easily get poached. But if you're the Jets and you've got an aging veteran in Aaron Rodgers, an aging backup in Tyrod Taylor, you've got these extra 7th round picks. Do you take a quarterback in the middle rounds and then take a quarterback with your Mr. Irrelevant pick and just try to keep that, have a practice squad stash? If the guy, listen, first of all, if he's Mr. Irrelevant, he's clearly not very high on anyone's board. And the name I'll mention because I like him and I've mentioned him several times, Jason Bean out of Kansas. So here's a guy, he's, teams are probably going to be turned off by his age. He's 25, 26 years old. Once this COVID exemption stuff goes away, it's going to be nice. And, we won't see as much of this guys entering the league, far beyond, much older than they have in years past. But Jason Bean, if you can get a guy like him, he's got a ton of college experience. Again, being 26, he's got a lot of years under his belt. Even if you're just talking about, practice time, he has had a good amount of playing time. Watch him last year. Jalen, the Kansas quarterback who I really liked, ended up hurting his back. Jason Bean played a lot for him in place of him. Does a nice job of throwing the deep ball. He's great runner, big time. Make big time plays with his legs. He can throw a deep ball. He can throw with touch. He's a guy. Again, we're talking as Mr. Irrelevant here, so I'm not going to sit here and paint a picture of a guy who's going to be an elite quarterback. But as an older guy with experience, you would imagine, more mature at 26. He's not 21, 22. Is he a guy you can draft after taking someone like Jordan Travis in the middle rounds or Michael Pratt or somebody along those lines? Spencer Rattler, who I like Rattler a lot. I just don't think he's going to be a guy who's on the board when the Jets are looking at a quarterback. I think he'll be gone before 72. So I think that's what puts you in the Pratt range, the Pratt-Travis range. And then once you take that guy and you get to Mr. Irrelevant, is it worth saying, is there a quarterback here that we even might be able to develop who we can then put on our practice squad? And maybe next year, the guy, maybe your Jordan Travis, your Michael Pratt, whoever, maybe that's your quarterback 2 next year. And the guy you take with Mr. Irrelevant is your number 3 next year. And start that quarterback factory, right? Who wouldn't, obviously the Jets would love to be a quarterback factory. When you do stuff like that, when you have multiple young QBs, and again, as I just said, Bean isn't, but when you're drafting a guy every year, and we saw this, right? People always love talking about the Ron Wolf philosophy in Green Bay, take one every year. There were a lot of times they had quarterbacks who were not great, but they were good enough to maybe get you a draft pick, right? Let's say your quarterback pans out. Again, dare to dream, right? But let's say the Jets draft a quarterback, develop that guy, and have a younger guy behind him. If you're doing the Ron Wolf thing and taking one every year, that guy doesn't have to be a superstar. You can have a 6th, 7th round pick who plays well in preseason, who has 3 or 4 games where he looks good in regular season. And next thing you know, you can deal that guy for a 2nd, 3rd round pick. So it's not just about having guys on the roster who can play, but once the guys show they can play even a little bit, they get, the value of those guys, the turnaround or the I should say the turnover. If you're turning over the bottom of that QB depth chart and you're getting guys in there. But let's start with one, shall we? Really, we shouldn't even be talking about years down the road and having quality quarterbacks. This team needs to draft one quarterback that they can develop. So again, you failed with Sanchez, you failed with Darnold, you didn't surround him with any weapons. Geno was probably another guy who was put on the field too early. Geno had maturity issues, but that he was a young kid, right? These things happen. And then of course Zach Wilson comes along, and Zach, and I talked about this recently. I mentioned it the other day with Dylan Terraman, Chris Schubert, and I was saying that I missed on some of the Zach stuff, but and obviously the Jets did too. But I think as I was saying that, or as we wrapped our show up, I thought some of the things he did as a pro that he did poorly didn't show up in college because he wasn't doing those things. He actually regressed as a Jet. And we've seen that with a lot of players at a lot of positions. And and that's the thing. We focus so much on quarterback. Um on the Jets misses at quarterback, as you should, because they've had many and it's the most important position in sports. But really, the Jets draft history in general. Like, who was the last, outside of the last few years, right? Until they, you can say Joe Tippmann is going to be a great player. We know about about Brees and Sauce and Garrett and those guys. But going out, from that point, working backwards, who were the great players they've drafted in the last 10, 15 years? Revis was a while ago. Brick, Mangold, those guys were a while ago. And it's skill positions. Who's the last great receiver before Garrett Wilson that the Jets drafted? You're going to say Keyshawn? Was Keyshawn great? Keyshawn did some things really well, but for the first overall pick, a guy you had for a few years and traded him, the Jets have just drafted poorly overall for, decades now, and it's we won't get into that now, but that's why I'm not as crazy, as harsh with Joe Douglas. I kind of look at, and not just the Jets, you look long term throughout the league, most picks fail. Most picks fail. But finding high level elite performers is not the norm. And I think I think Joe Tippmann will be an elite performer. I think, we know about Sauce and those guys. We know Michael Carter, the corner, is one of the best corners in the NFL. Like, you've drafted 5 or 6 guys who are cornerstone pieces, who are guys that you've got to have that. And Michael Carter's an interesting one because he's going into the last year of his deal. But there are a lot of cornerstone guys on this roster. Those don't come along easy. They're not just, I say all the time, I feel like Madden and the ability to draft and develop everyone into a Pro Bowler in year one on Madden has kind of skewed people's views of the NFL or of the NFL draft. KD said Sam had an XFL roster at best. It was ugly. It was ugly. Sam had so little to work with. And it was frustrating, but he hasn't done a lot better since, but look at the situations he's been in since then, right? Matt Rule, who was, I was wrong on him. I thought Matt Rule was going to be a really good coach. I thought the fact he had college experience, NFL experience, offense experience, defense experience, he'd built and won everywhere he'd been. I mean, I don't know what else you want, right? I mean, the resume was there. He should have been a success. But he wasn't. Like I said, you win at every level. You coach both sides of the ball. I thought, and again, coached under Tom Coughlin with the Giants. So everything on Matt Rule's resume pointed to this guy should be a really good coach, and he wasn't. And then Darnold, plays for San Fran last year, and you think, oh, if he gets on the field for a while, he might show something. He played a couple games. He didn't do a whole lot. And now he's in Minnesota, where he might start again, and he's gonna have some weapons in Minnesota. And he'll play, I would imagine, but he's going to have to hold off whatever rookie QB Minnesota brings in. And you would have to imagine that the Vikings are going to move up with those 2 first rounders and try to get themselves a quarterback, Drake May, JJ McCarthy, whoever it may be. KD says Jets offensive players somehow always get hurt or don't live up to expectations, even if the expectations are doing the bare minimum. It happens a lot, man. It really does. But, that's where I look at the coaching staffs too. This team so often especially the quarterback, the OCs, you have guys that with such little experience, such little track record of success, and that makes it really frustrating. Injuries, of course, like look at Michael Carter. Not injured, but whatever the reason, and we've talked about Michael Carter. The running back Michael Carter, who was sent packing last year. I think he's a solid player. He probably would have been one of the better offensive players they've drafted in a while. But they signed Dalvin Cook and he couldn't get on the field. And, this is just my theory. I'm not pretending to have sources. I know some people pretend to have sources. I'm not pretending to have sources. But Michael Carter's a guy who they have a team meeting, let everyone air out their grievances, and 24 hours later he's cut. Like, you don't think he said something in that meeting about the fact that the guy who was playing ahead of him was averaging 2 yards a carry and he was averaging over 4 yards a carry? Like, hey, can I get some run here? You're benching me for a guy who's at 2.3 a carry and I'm at 4.4 or whatever it was. So I would imagine Michael Carter got tired of A, losing, and B, not getting a chance to play. Like, it's one thing, that was the thing with Elijah Moore, right? Elijah Moore is complaining and I don't want to be here. And as a fan, you're like, hey man, the team's winning. Just be quiet. Just do what you're doing. It's working. You're on a winning streak for the first time in a millennium. Just go. You start losing games, you're not getting targets, fine, speak up. And say, hey, I can help us win. Michael Carter, not the case. The team couldn't move the football to save their lives. And he couldn't get any run. And the guy ahead of him was averaging 2 yards a carry. So Michael Carter probably opened his mouth and found himself getting traded. Jarrell says this is going to be an interesting draft this week. Listen, draft is always interesting, but this one particularly because, all this talk about, is it going to be quarterback? I don't think there's ever been a draft that starts with 4 quarterbacks. And I could see a path to that because this is just the way it goes. If a team doesn't have a quarterback, sometimes you got to reach. Sometimes you got to take a guy that you wouldn't normally take a guy you may not even believe he's a franchise guy, but you're like, man, he's better than what we've got. You've got to sell the fans on something. That's where the Broncos, excuse me, this is what I was listening to one show earlier, and they were talking about the tough spot that the Raiders and the Broncos are both in because you've got to sell your fans on, come out and watch us this year because, and even if it's a rookie who you're not sure he's going to be the guy, but maybe you can develop him into the guy. I don't think Broncos fans are going to get fired up about Jarrett Stidham or Zach Wilson. Although I think I might be more fired up about Wilson. I don't know. Although Stidham, let's give Stidham some credit. He's done some good things in the limited opportunities he's had. I don't know what Jarrett Stidham is going to be, but you certainly, and that's not to say the Broncos won't take a quarterback this week. I've said several times I think they're a candidate to take Bo Nix or Michael Penix. I think, Sean Payton, and I mentioned this earlier with Biff. Payton has said he's proud of his track record of drafting quarterbacks. He shouldn't be. His track record, you look at the quarterbacks he's taken, and it's not pretty. But if you're the Broncos and you need a quarterback and you're sitting there at 12 and Michael Penix is on the board and Bo Nix is on the board, would you rather one of those guys or Zach Wilson and Jarrett Stidham? I would imagine to get the fan base fired up, you would want to go ahead and grab a quarterback that, the shiny new toy, right? But listen, if they don't think it's the right thing to do, then don't do it. But Zach Wilson gone to Denver, and it's up to the Jets to figure out if they're going to learn from this. Are we going to finally, when we take a guy who's not ready, are we going to rush him? Or are we going to pump the brakes, get him? Again, this goes back years as well. Not bringing in a veteran presence to work with these guys. What did I say a few minutes ago? If you look at Darnold, Geno, Sanchez, Zach, I would imagine the best any of them looked at their peak for a sustained, and by sustained, I mean for a 6 or 7 week stretch, was probably Darnold. And I'm going off memory here. Maybe I'm wrong. But to the best I can recall, for an old guy, Darnold probably looked the best, and it was when he had Josh McCown in his ear. He had a vet, and I guess, yeah, Sanchez did have Brunell, but again, Sanchez had some success, and the Jets had some success with Sanchez, I should say, and he wasn't asked to do a whole lot, and that was the way that may have been one of the better things that team did. So we're drafting a kid. Let's not ask him to do a whole lot, but you can't have a guy play his whole career that way. And once you started asking Sanchez to do more, he got exposed and he just wasn't very good. And like I said, out of the league in a few years. So it's an opportunity to learn for the Jets. Joe Douglas, you want to produce a QB factory? Well, get the parts in place to build that factory. Yeah, you got to get the quarterbacks, but make sure your O-line is squared away. Make sure you have some targets for the guy to throw to. Make sure there is a veteran quarterback in the room that guy can lean on, and make sure you've got somebody on the offensive staff who has been a part of a franchise that has developed a quarterback. And I'm not talking about a guy who just happened to work in the building, somebody who was part of it. Again, the Knapp thing was obviously tragic, terrible situation. But there was no course correct after that. The Jets were just happy to move forward with who they had on staff. And Zach, and listen, someone said earlier, if Peyton develops Zach Wilson, it's going to look terrible for the Jets. If anyone develops Zach Wilson, it's going to look terrible for the Jets. And of course, how typical that Zach Wilson in his final game as a Jet, his final full game, was by far his best game as a pro, where you don't know if the light came on or if it was an aberration. Like, is this just a fluke game? Like every now and then he puts one together. But that was probably the most free and easy sort of, almost like he finally got to the point where he was like, I got nothing else to lose. I'm just going to go throw the ball around and see what happens. And we saw, the touch passes to Conklin over the middle, where he put the ball up for Conklin to go and get it. He looked really good in that game, and you're watching it. And I remember thinking, because remember the story had already leaked that the Jets were going to deal him. And I remember thinking, if he can play anywhere close to this level over the final 4 weeks, the Jets will get a mid-round pick for him. Maybe a couple of fours, maybe a 3 and a 4. If he'd closed out his career with, 4 consecutive games of 275 or more and a couple touchdowns and protect the ball, like you'd say maybe the lights, and maybe the Jets even considered keeping him, but that doesn't matter. Obviously, it didn't happen. He has one, or not one of, he has the best game of his career, and then the following week he gets a concussion, and then they just put him in bubble wrap and say, stay off to the side for the rest of the year. We'll send you somewhere else when the year rolls around. Before we wrap up, a couple comments here. Bernard says they need to sit, look at Rodgers in Green Bay, and I get that, Bernard, and this is part of my point. I think everything is case by case. Like, some guys are ready right away, some guys are close enough to ready, and the team is like just good enough that they know they're not going to lose. They're not going to be any worse off by starting a guy. So, hey, let baptism by fire. Peyton Manning, right? Peyton started right away. Everyone talks about Peyton Manning's rookie season. Oh, look at Peyton play. It's okay to be terrible as a rookie. Peyton was terrible as a rookie. Go back and look at Peyton Manning as a rookie. Look at his box scores. Look at his production from games 1 through 8 and then games 9 through 16. Completely different guy. It took Peyton 7-8 games for it to click, and he started to become Peyton Manning by the middle of his rookie season. So starting him right away worked out, but he was Peyton Manning. His dad was an NFL quarterback, a really good one. So not everyone has that upbringing. Peyton was in a situation where he should have played right away, and every guy is different. But the Jets really haven't. Again, Zach, there were issues with him that needed to be worked on. With Darnold, there were, the Jets openly discussed. If you think back, after the Jets drafted Darnold, they said, we know there's flaws to his game, but we're going to let him play through those, and we'll work on them later. It didn't work out so well. I get that they thought they were good enough or that he could do enough. Obviously, he couldn't. But between Sam and Gino and Sanchez and Zach, at some point, the Jets have to say, you know what? Let's draft a guy while we're in position to sit him behind somebody who can play the position competently. And that's why this next couple of years for Rodgers is so big, not just for him, but for the Jets. Because if he can, I keep saying you need to treat Rodgers because of the injury now. Of course, he's back from that, but because of his age and the likelihood of an injury, every year should be approached as if it's his final year. But you hope he can give you a couple. And even if he does just give you one, Jordan Travis, Michael Pratt, whoever, Spencer Rattler, if you can manage to get him, whatever quarterback you take, at least that guy's going to have one full year in a quarterback room with Rodgers and Tyrod Taylor, who, again, Tyrod Taylor, he's got a lot of miles. He's got a lot of experience. He's another guy. It's not just about Aaron Rodgers, and which could be a good thing because Aaron Rodgers and Tyrod Taylor, two different styles of quarterback. So there's a lot of brain picking that can go on in that quarterback room for a young signal caller and those two passers versus the guys in the past who didn't really have much to lean on. So that'll wrap this one up. Zach Wilson gone out the door. I wish the kid luck. He did what was asked of him. The Jets failed him, as they often do. Now, do the Jets learn from it? And I hope Zach has himself a nice career. I don't think he's a bad guy. I think he needed a reset. The Jets needed a reset, and now he's in a situation that people said he needed. He's got an offensive-minded coach who's got a track record of success in the league. Granted, not a ton of success without Drew Brees, but at the same time, look at what Russell Wilson did last year, 2022, versus 2023. Much better quarterback in 2023. And who was Russell Wilson's head coach in 2022? Yeah. That'll do it for this one, Jets fans. Have a good one. Tomorrow night, myself, Chris Schubert, Dylan Terraman, we're gonna run our final mocks. We'll have some last minute thoughts and notes on players, and then we are going to attempt to do a pick 1 through 257 marathon over 3 days. So check us out on YouTube for the entire draft. We're gonna have as many player highlights available as possible, and look at everything, not just around the league, but from a Jets perspective and how each pick affects the Jets, either within the division or as the board is falling. Last one here, Highlander Prime. Let's see. You're one of the few fans who actually have a balanced view of Zach's tenure here, Glenn. Got here late, but cheers, brother. Thanks a lot, Highlander. Listen, as fans of this team, there are days, weeks, months where we get way too low or way too high and way too critical or maybe not critical enough. I do my best to be fair and objective. And with Zach, I feel like, and look, I was a big Zach guy. I wanted him. But he did fail in areas where he could have done better. But the Jets also failed him. So it was a collective effort, his failure in New York. But I do think he was a talented kid. And I think he was a good kid. So look, if guys come in and work, if they put in the work and there's nothing we're hearing about guys not being interested or not putting forth the effort, then I wish him well on the way out the door. I know people like, oh, he's not a Jet anymore. Screw that guy. I hate him. Look, he's a human being. I can wish that nice human being well. Have a good career, whoever it may be. I don't like personally hate these guys and want them to fail because they don't wear the right uniform. But some people do. I'm not one of them. Have a good one. We will see you tomorrow night and then each of the following 3 days. Have a good one, Jets fans.